So, in terms of wildland fire management in Oregon, specifically in the Willamette Valley, which my project looks at, there's a history of documented indigenous burning. And what that is essentially a wildland fire management strategy where things are purposefully burned. However, in terms of evidence of indigenous burning in the Willamette Valley, what we can mostly see is, in fact, that wildland fire management was actually just completely cultural, and it was not to scale to manage the forests or habitats of Oregon at large, or even a significant percentage of the Willamette Valley, and in fact may have primarily been used to create empty land for built space, such as teepees or other temporary structures. So Oregon itself is home to a large saltwater coast, shrublands, grasslands, juniper savanna, and a variety of hardwood forests. And it also has a significant watershed in terms of the Cascade snowpack, which we'll talk more about later. So the main point of focusing on the history of wildland fire management is obviously due to the fact that Oregon has been struggling with incredibly unpredictable and a highly increased rate of wildland fire, particularly in vulnerable areas at the wildland urban interface. And so the Oregon Department of Forestry, which manages Oregon's fire response, is really struggling and is actually massively in debt as of January 2024. So my project was looking at why wildland fire management is perceived the way that it is, and how we actually are able to manage it, and how we might be responding to it, not necessarily by perhaps looking into more ways in which we can do wildland fire management, which is very expensive and time consuming, but looking into the ways in which buildings are flammable or vulnerable in that of themselves, and then also why climate change in Oregon is exacerbating the effects of wildland fire. And so one of the reasons for that is that we actually generate a huge amount of shed in our forests because of our large logging industry, and we also do not have the funds, as previously mentioned, to properly manage our wildland fire. So we have essentially four distinct habitats in Oregon that are relevant to this project, namely the sagebrush steppe and coastal conifers, which are in the wetter and more coastal parts of Oregon, and then the prairie grass and oak savanna. So why is this relevant? So many species of plants are actually in harmony or coexist with wildland fire. And so if we look back at the history of the Willamette Valley and its habitats long before, as well as its soil sediment, we can actually find evidence that there was wildland fire that swept through cyclically the Willamette Valley for many years. But species actually are specifically adapted to be burned and then grow back. And this is actually for many plants such as Brassiosamatium or camas, or bear grass or other grasses and prairie grasses in general. This is a part of their life cycle. But the important thing to learn from studying these plants is that, in essence, wildland fire management, or burning constantly and every year at a massive and human orchestrated scale, is actually very harmful to these plants' natural life cycles, and is actually not congruent with what they would naturally experience. So why is that? So Willamette Valley, according to historical documentation in 1850, actually used to have a massive distribution of three primary habitats, which were the grasslands, the oak savanna, and riparian, which is also river adjacent, meaning habitats. But due to climate change, unfortunately, we have lost essentially all of these habitats to that. So, where are we then? So, in 2020, there was a horrific fire called the Holiday Farm Fire that massively tore the facade off of where we are in terms of wildland fire management, and also where we are in terms of climate change. And William Robbins, who is an excellent resource on this and an environmental history professor at Oregon State, wrote a book called The Age of Megafires in the American West, which I strongly recommend. But he cited essentially that he, in all of his years studying weather, has not seen anything as predictable as what we are currently experiencing. And so we're actually seeing completely unseasonably cold and strong high pressure and then strong and thermally induced low pressure winds that are blowing southeast and then across central and southern Oregon coast. And so this would massively spread fires and has. And so Robbins actually did not predict any wildfire threat in 2020 in the Western Cascades, and then of course was proved horrifically wrong. And so his book and his studies are congruent with all of the resources that we can see from 1850 and from documentation of wildland fire management through organizations such as the Oregon Department of Forestry, wherein we are simply not able to contain the issue. As you can see, climate change is proving to create a rapidly changing and unpredictable landscape. So where does this matter? For architecture, it will be the wildland-urban interface. This is mostly surrounding Lane County, where we live, and unfortunately, it is also a huge spot where people want to residentially develop because it is the space where attractive residential land or property merges into the forest, which is attractive for many people. So the problem with that is that the average American house is actually not meant to be defensive to fire, and actually has many architectural features that make it dangerous when burned. And so one of the main things that I was focusing on for this project was the material library or material qualities of resilient buildings. And so what we currently use, which is a very easy method of construction, usually stick framing, is actually very destructive and potentially dangerous when burned. And the reason for that is that most of the plastic components that are used on a building's exterior, such as vinyl siding or other materials that I'll get into, release what are called VOCs, or brominated flame retardants, when they burn. Why is this relevant? So Oregon experiences massive pollution of its waterways and airways from fires in Canada, New York as well, but also from its own fires. And so this creates a cycle in which the residents of Eugene, which are on a massive water well, are likely intaking the chemicals that are present in our built environment. So these would be hydrogen cyanide, chloride, polyhydrocarbons, dioxins, which are incredibly deadly, and many, many more heavy metals and other toxic organic compounds. So as you can see, we are sitting on a massive drainage basin, and we also experience a very much affected air quality from the fires. So if we are to look at bigger problems with the system in Oregon as well, one thing that is majorly notable and part of the problem with resilient architecture is that people need systems that are much improved upon relying on fire insurance to solve the problem, or relying on wildland fire management to solve the problem. And in fact, while researching how fire insurance works, I was unfortunately unhappy to learn that it is actually a process involving 5 stages or adjusters, which are people that essentially mediate your claim and can severely impact your ability to actually reclaim the value of your home. So, what could we be? So, in terms of formal elements of fire conscious design, this is a bit of a guide onto research that I've done about what that would be and what that would look like. And so the main factors for making a piece of resilient architecture are a lot of very intentional siting and intentional form before you begin to make smaller micro choices on a material or finishing level. And so some of those can include, as what we can see here, but the major ones that I think that people need to be concerned about are obviously fencing and bridges between differing structures, and roof slope and orientation, as well as orientation of actual buildings, but also the materials used on the exterior and interior. So things you should not use: brominated flame retardants, PFAs, plastic-based installations, which, although attractive for our values, are completely unsafe if burned. Anything that releases dioxin gas, which is most appliances that are going to be installed permanently in your home, and any kind of fiberglass, as well as vinyls, plexiglasses, any sort of polyside material, plastic carpets, and most resins and glues, as well as recycled plastics. Instead, there's a number of building systems that are actually not coded for the US, but that we could use instead, and that may potentially be more effective. So, if we look at the building cultures of other countries, they actually typically use a lot more natural materials and they don't rely on stick building with plastic exteriors, which is something that we do in the US a lot. In terms of what this could be, you can actually build entirely using hemp or wool or using only wood or cellulose insulation as opposed to normative forms of building materials. You may also choose an alternative building structure, and that might come in the form of mass timber or terracotta, both of which are renewable materials, which I want to be focusing more on in different research. Essentially, the way that these systems work is by entirely using wood and natural materials for the full extent of both the interior and exterior finishes. So when these burn, they burn very cleanly and they do not burn in a way that releases PFAs or chemicals into the environment for years to come. And so I would say that I would advocate for these more over traditional building materials that are going to potentially off gas or affect wildland fire management in the sense that the immediate environment might become that much more toxic after a fire. So that is essentially where I've been at with the research and in creating solutions as well to that. The area of resilient architecture is something that I think needs to be discussed as well as the area of disaster resilient architecture. I know this isn't a typical research project and it involves perhaps more creative aspects as well, um, but I am excited to continue the research, particularly into complete wood constructions or ceramic constructions, as well as buildings or materials that actually can improve upon pollution in their very nature, such as titanium dioxide buildings or green facades and the like. So, thank you. Hi, my name is Snow. I'm going to be presenting a research project that I did on resilient architecture or the characteristics of resilient architecture. There's a lot of content in the full booklet, and so I will be trying to share the most relevant things